evening. You joined me here in our summer house. I thought this might be an interesting place to share with you what I preached yesterday as part of my reader training. It's been a really strange few months, hasn't it? We've been really restricted in where we can go. And that set me thinking too, how do we meet God if there are only certain places we can go to? And there are certain places we can't go to, church for instance. So that was what I wanted to think about. And I started thinking about that in terms of where did the people of Israel find God? Well, you'll remember when he first travelled with them through the wilderness, he dwelt in the tabernacle that they made him. Basically, it was a tent and it travelled with them and God travelled with them. Then Solomon built the temple and God dwelt in the temple, and the people of Israel could meet God there, hear from him, get right with him through the sacrifices. And then we get to the time of Jesus, and you'll remember that strange story that Mary and Joseph take Jesus to Jerusalem with them when he must have been about a teenager, and on the way home they find they've lost him, and they eventually find him in the temple, which he then describes as his Father's house. So how do we answer this question of where do we meet God? Well, the first part of the answer to that is what happened when Jesus dies on the cross. And you'll remember that at the point where Jesus dies, the huge veil that separated the most holy part of the temple from the rest of the temple was rent in two, symbolizing that God was no longer just in that place. And then we move on in time, and I want to think about a verse in Paul where he talks about the temple of God. And we read in 1 Corinthians 3:16, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Paul is writing to the church he founded. Perhaps he phrases this as a question because he knows that he taught them the answer to that question in person. He's talking about the body of believers being God's temple themselves. When they gather together, God's Spirit dwells in them as a gathered congregation, and that's where you meet God. That's where those who don't know God find him, in the gathered group of believers. So maybe that's the answer now. We can't find God in church. We can't go to church, but we can find God when we're gathered together. But then we reach a second impasse, don't we? We can't gather together. And in fact, we don't know when we will be able to gather together. There are plans to open church, but only for private prayer, not for us to meet as a group. So how do we get past that? Well, the same letter of Paul, he returns to this idea. And in chapter 6, verse 19, we read, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own?" So Paul develops this idea. God's temple is not just the gathered believers. God's temple is every single individual believer. So if you know Jesus and God's Spirit dwells in you because you know Jesus, you are the place where you meet God, and where the people that you meet will meet with God and hear from God. We're little walking temples. Wherever we go, we take God with us. We take his ministry with us. We take his presence with us. So when can we meet God? Well, here we come to a fascinating idea that I found in my Lent book, from a book by Cardinal Basil Hume called The Sacrament of the Present Moment. The book's called Blunderland, and the idea is the sacrament of the present moment. And the idea is that a sacrament is an outward sign of an inner grace, a bit like Holy Communion or baptism, or I can't think of any more now, but that's a sacrament. And the sacrament at the present moment is because actually now is the only time we can know God Now is the only time we can serve God, because the past is gone. We can be lost in it, we can be trapped by it, we can be distracted by it, but we can't live in it. And we can't live in the future because the future hasn't come yet. Again, it can be a longing and a distraction and a worry, but actually the only time we get to live in is now. And that's why it's a sacrament, because we meet God in the now, the present moment. And what's fascinating is that that idea is the central idea behind mindfulness and behind lots of the Ignatian finding God in all things practices. And it was actually mindfulness and learning mindfulness that saved me at a point about 4 years ago when I almost couldn't cope because of pressures at work. And it was finding mindfulness and my faith that got me through. And so that's what makes that idea really precious, and why I wanted to explore it together with that idea that we meet God in our own bodies. So where can we meet God? In ourselves, in our bodies. Nothing can restrict that access to God. Nothing can trap you or restrict you finding God in your own body, where God's Spirit dwells. And when can you find him? Right now, in the moment, right now.